Hello and welcome to the Guya Samaja Center. I hope you're enjoying the video. Please consider making a donation by clicking on the Y button on the upper right hand corner of the screen. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Before we get into the actual, returning to the actual text, I wanted to just very briefly sort of suggest that we try something. And so, start like this. So first, just take a moment and notice, mindfully check in with how you're feeling. So not mindfulness of breathing, but just like notice, like check in with your body. You know what I mean? Like notice, okay, what am I feeling right now? You know, what's my emotional state? And then I want to ask you to, in this case, to bring to mind, so I want to ask you to kind of think about something, which is to think about when you were, let's focus particularly on when you were young, like so as young as you know, like a child or teenager, so from the early part of your life, to think about somebody who you think of as like particularly having been loving and kind and helpful to you, who showed genuine kindness to you. And it could be anybody, so it could be a parent, it could be a grandparent, aunt, uncle, sibling, or a friend of the family, or a teacher. So just whoever comes to mind who gives you that feeling, like, oh yeah, that person really was kind to me, or was very loving to me, or cared deeply for me, or was looked out for me, whatever phrase sort of resonates for you. And take a moment to do a few things. First of all, think of that. So just pick one person. Okay? So even if there were more, obviously there may have been many people who were kind to you, but just think of one. And then think about that person's, first of all, think of their face, what it looked like back then, when they would see you, or when they interacted with you. Think of their demeanor, like what it was like to be around them. Think of, how it felt when they were doing what they did in relation to you. Particularly when they were doing kind things for you, or just being kind presence, or actually doing things for you. Think of what it felt like, of what the interaction was like. If they made you feel safe, or they made you feel cared about, or made you feel loved. They comforted you in some way, or they made you feel more hopeful of your future, whichever was true for you in that relationship. want to take this one more step. Like you can, well, no, maybe that's good. So really just think about what they've, and then at the end, again now check in about how you're feeling. Like notice the actual emotion. You know, mindfully checking with your body. How are you feeling? Then I ask if people would just share, you know, share as much as you feel like. Like, what was your, you know, what'd you notice? What was it like to think of this person, whoever came to mind to you? So just go ahead and you can interact with it. So, you know, I mean, it was a very small group today, so it's okay. Like, we can just share. I mean, we have to break it into groups or. That's why I thought about more people would break it into groups to it. But so, what was people's experience to remember somebody? What was it like?
Very pleasant. Comforting.
Comforting feeling. Pleasant, comforting.
Yeah, I noticed it kind of relaxed the physiology of my body some, and kind of like a feeling of warmth, emotional warmth.
Was it similar for you guys or different?
No.
What was your experience like?
Well, my experience actually when I was young was actually I felt uncomfortable.
Oh, say why, yeah. Or say what it was like. I mean, not why. But.
Because I had a dysfunction. So this is my aunt. So you know she's very loving. I just remember that her love seems unconditional, but it seems at least when I was growing up, it seemed unfamiliar when we would occasionally see her.
Oh, that's interesting. So it brought up that unfamiliar feeling or that uncomfortable of it. That's interesting. That's important, I think, because that can happen.
Yeah.
Oh. It's good to notice these things. That's why I'm asking everybody. Like, it's good to notice these things. That's normal. It's many people have that experience. And anything you want to add, as? No. Okay. Because the reason why I say it's important is that, like, if you do this exercise enough, every kind of feeling will come up. Like, you know, because we're about to get into the kindness of the mother beings, right? And so, if you really do this meditation intensively, pleasant feelings will come up, warm feelings will come up, but also our resistances will come up, our whatever issues we have about, like, receiving kindness, or about vulnerability, or about, you know, that they can also come up if you do the practice intensively. That's normal. So that's why I wanted to do this, both to notice the positive feelings that come up, but also to note this point that if you do this meditation intensively, it will be healing, but it'll also be you'll have to work through things. Does that make sense? I think that's normal. So I wanted to say that first. And then I want to say another point before we get into the first topic, which is, so this meditation, I mean, the way it's presented in this text is fairly simple, like it's straightforward, you know, it's like step by step. But first of all, I want to make a few points. One is, you know, if you're just doing a review meditation, you can just go through these points, right? Like, you know, oh wow, they do that, they do this, they do that. But like if you were to do like a retreat on this topic, or you were to meditate on it, like, you know, for a period of time every day, it's extremely powerful in a way, and and I think from our culture, you know, like, you know, in Tibetan culture, everybody now, I mean, after centuries of Buddhism being the main practice in Tibet, you know, like it's not like even Tibetans, they just go around going, oh, mother beings, you know, all mother sentient beings, like it's their normal culture. Of course, I think about this, you know, being a psychologist, like in our culture, first of all, people rarely speak about the kindness of their mother. And actually, like I think it's like due to a misunderstanding of Freud in a way, culturally, like there's almost like kind of among educated people, there's almost a cynicism. You know, like it's cooler to sort of talk about, oh, well, my mother was whatever, you know, neurotic or something, I don't know, some way, or, you know, like, I say that's a misunderstanding because it is. It's a misunderstanding of psychoanalysis, actually, but it's sort of infiltrated through our culture in some way. But actually, do you mind if I go off on a slight tangent on that? I wrote a book about this topic, so I thought about it a lot. And I'll share one reflection just from that research, which is a point from D.W. Winnicott, who was probably one of the most prominent psychoanalytic thinkers after Freud. And he said that he was a child psychiatrist, actually, and he said something that was intriguing to me in relation to this meditation. He said, every person I'm going to paraphrase, but he basically said, every person who's sane, and every person for whom being in the world means something, as an adult, owes an infinite debt of gratitude to somebody else, and it's usually a woman. Which was, I think, a touching phrase, and modern scientific research bears out his point. There was, they did those studies about attachment, right? And when they look at, they looked at children in orphanages in the Russian bloc countries who were fed adequately but weren't held and weren't spoken to and weren't sung to and of course many of them just died. Food is not enough to survive. And those who did survive physically, many of them had what they later came to call a reactive attachment disorder, which was like this disorder where basically a failure to thrive and an inability to relate to the world. Like we're just like, their bodies survived, but their brain didn't develop correctly. And a lot of those folks, I've worked with a few people like that, who just were so neglected and so abused as children that they couldn't form relationships, couldn't, I don't just mean like romantic relationships, but couldn't form friendships, couldn't find a sense of meaning and purpose and sort of what it's like to sort of to be in the world as a human being in a sense, because our brains need that. And so my point is like, sometimes people think of like, it's a cultural difference, that's what I'm pointing out. So sometimes when people read this, they sort of think, oh, the kindness of other beings, like my mom, we can all say, oh, my mom wasn't perfect, right? Because actually D.W. Winnicott said there's no such thing as a perfect mother, and he coined a phrase. He said like, he used to say, the kindness of the ordinary good enough mother is inconceivable. That was his phrase. And what he meant was, like, that's what we should look for. It's just an ordinary good enough mother, and that's what this is addressing. Does that make sense? This isn't addressing some perfect person. This is addressing somebody who, so it's addressing what Winnicott was saying. In other words, that if you're somebody who's capable of having a friend, right, and who's capable of speaking, and who's capable of like having meaningful interaction in society, like having a career, or having relationships, or having, then somebody was very kind to you when you were an infant and a toddler and a young child, or that wouldn't have happened, like, from a biological point of view. Does that make sense? So this is, I mean, it goes beyond that, but this is mainly addressing that level of, and it doesn't have to, and so that's one point. And then another point is, and the Dalai Lama, and all the commentaries say this, we're using the term mother here, but they all point out that it doesn't have to be your literal mother that you contemplate. And the Dalai Lama said, I wrote it down, he said, if you have difficulty with your mother, focus on some other person who is kind to you. The point is to develop compassion. Right? So the point isn't to torture yourself or sort of jump through hoops or something like that. The point is to have an experience that allows you to develop more compassion and connection with others. Does that make sense? So I just want to say that as a preface, because sometimes people like have a kind of, I don't know how to say it right. If the person's relationship to their particular mother, right, if somebody, there are all kinds of situations, so, but if the relationship to the particular person who is one's biological mother is fraught and complex, then it's okay to just start with somebody else, like, whoever you have this feeling, they were unusually kind to me, I feel this feeling of connection to them, and that they loved me, that's the idea. We could say more about all those things, but I want to say all that as a preface. And I want to bring up one more point, though. Like, so, the warm feeling that you guys described, or the sort of, whatever, you could describe it different ways, right? An open-hearted feeling, or a feeling of gratitude, or a feeling of connection, or like, there's one more thing that we don't often, some people do, but that many people don't often contemplate in our culture. It certainly isn't a major topic in our culture, and that's infinity. Right? Like, so, I'm just pausing. Like, there are exceptions, right? I remember as a kid, when sometimes my grandfather would take me out, he'd say, let's look at the stars. You know, we'd stand there and just look up, and he'd go, he'd talk about infinity. He'd say, like, there's an infinite number that, you know, you can't, they're incountable, and space is infinite. You know, he would sort of contemplate these things, but that was, I think, kind of rare. So this meditation also, so one thing is, from a cultural point of view, I'm just saying, this is like my cultural introduction. One is this idea of receiving kindness, which again, we tend not to even focus on in our culture in general, actually, that much, you know, like, which I think is kind of horrible, actually, really. It's like a terrible mistake, because, actually, the research shows that. I'm going off on another tangent here, but the research shows that. And they were just thinking, it was amazing, like, they did like lots of studies like this, like where they said, oh, just write down 3 things a day you're grateful for, or something, you know, positive psychology. They were like, oh, wow, people are happier, and they're more content with their lives when they just write down 3 things in a journal. You know, it's like, well, first of all, of course, you know, like, and the idea was like, if they wrote down 3 things, it made them more aware to be grateful, right? And then they were like, oh, I was also grateful for, like, my Slurpee or whatever, I don't know, like, you know, it was like, oh, good, you know, so the idea, I just want to share that, the idea, like, that it was a radical intervention. I've had that experience as a therapist. Like, it's, for many people, it's a radical intervention to think of 3 things a day that you're grateful for, which is the exact opposite of the way Bodhisattva, like Mahayana training is, right? In Mahayana training, can you imagine, like, so that's what I'm getting at. Like, so imagine that, like, if you thought, oh, I don't usually think of 3 things I'm grateful for a day. Like, I'm too busy to think about what I'm grateful for. Like, you know, from a Buddhist point of view, like, oh my goodness, right? Like, because here what you're doing is you're developing infinite gratitude, right? You're not just listing 3 things. Like, you're saying, I'm infinitely grateful for an infinite amount of kindness I've received. And so I'm just pointing out, like, the difference. Can you imagine, like, how does it affect you, right? If a person just thinking, 3 things, like, I was grateful that somebody lent me $5, and I was grateful that this person let me in on the freeway, and I was great, you know, like if somebody does that, right, and they, oh, I'm happier, I noticed that somebody let me in on the freeway. Like, so, you know, and that's all their gratitude for the day. Imagine that. And so first of all, that's good, right? It's better than none. But then contrast that with this. Here you're developing, in this practice, you're developing an infinite, right? An infinite, like, just pause for a moment, right? Like, because I was saying 3, right? So you take 3 and then you make it 6. You take 6 and make it 12. And then if you go up to like 1 trillion, right? And what happens, just like contemplate for a moment, what happens if you have infinity and you subtract 1 trillion? What are you left with? Learn from math class? What's infinity minus 1 trillion? Infinity, right? You can't, it doesn't decrease it in the slightest, right? And infinity minus 100 trillion is infinity, right? Like, so infinity is infinite, right? It has no beginning and no end, right? So to imagine, so what we're cultivating in a way is feelings of love, of affection, and gratitude that are like that. Right? Just think about that for a moment, right? Like, because for us, like, I mean, to start with, like, just to develop a sincere feeling of love for one person, right? Like to say, okay, I'm going to develop a sense of love that, and in this sense, love, right, is like, where you're not trying to get something from them, not that kind of love, but just love like a love that says I adore them, they're precious, and I wish them everything happy, right? Like, that's amazing, right? Like, to develop just that one feeling for one person, right? In this contemplation, we're developing that, again, infinitely. So I'm just pointing out, infinity is an important topic in this whole, right from the very beginning we're going to see it. Infinity is going to become very important for this whole meditation. And so we have to kind of be willing to pause and sort of contemplate what is infinity. Right? Like, and the idea here is that the implication of this meditation is that you're an infinite being, right, who's existed infinitely, and who will exist infinitely, and who's infinitely interconnected with an infinite number of other beings. Can you imagine that? Like, is that how you usually see yourself, right? Oftentimes we see ourselves as this, like, I don't know, you know, like we're enclosed in our own skin, and then we enclose our skin in our car. You know, we go around or something, right? Like, we enclose our skin in our house, and we kind of lock the doors and are afraid that other people will bother us. Or something like that. Here, you're viewing yourself, it's changing your whole self-image, right? You're viewing yourself as somebody who's already is infinite, right? and who already has been infinitely connected with everyone, and others are infinite. Does that make sense? Like, that's really the worldview here. So you have to kind of get that, or this won't make sense. Does that make sense? Okay, that's my introduction. So in the first, so this is the 7-point, right? We did last week equanimity, which we'll mention again, but well, I'm not going to cover that now because that was the preliminary. And then we entered the 7. So this is one of the 2 methods of generating bodhicitta. Right? There's 2 ways to generate bodhicitta. As it said, this one comes through Kamala Shila, particularly. It comes from the Buddha originally, but the way Lama Tsongkhapa presents it is particularly, from the way Kamala Shila sort of describes it in its stages of meditation. So the first of the 7 points, right? So 7 points. So there's 7 causes and 1 effect. The effect is bodhicitta. So we're trying to give rise to bodhicitta. And we said last time, Lama Tsongkhapa points this out, that these first 3 steps are like, these first 3 that we're about to cover are like the, let's say it right, or sort of the main topic in a way, and all the others kind of flow from those. Does that make sense? So you've got to do these 3 well, or the other ones won't come. That's one point. Oh, we're up to page 140. Another point I'll make is like, I'll share this also, like, this isn't supposed to be an easy, even though it's presented briefly here, it's not an easy topic to realize. Like, and I'll share this just so I thought it was interesting. I think it was like Rinpa Rinpoche used to sometimes say, you know, oh, like renunciation, like, you know, the like impermanence and death and karma and renunciation, up to renunciation of samsara. You say if you do a retreat and like you really practice, those are easy to realize. With this bodhicitta, the equalizing exchange, that takes a year. That's hard. You know, like, that even for the lamas who would go off and retreat, it would take a while. Like they would have to meditate on this repeatedly for a long period of time, and they would realize bodhicitta, but it's harder. And that's just because we're like more ingrained with self-centeredness. It's so ingrained in us that it would take effort to overcome it. So anyway, the first of the 7 points is, how do you phrase it? Meditating on all sentient beings as one's mother, or seeing, or you know, meditating on that, or contemplating, or imagining, or seeing all sentient beings as one's mother. And remember, here, mother in this context can be the literal. Well, it's meaning literal mother, but mainly it means like you'll see when we get into it. But as kind to you. Does that make sense? As somebody who's meditating on all sentient beings is incredibly kind. So I'll read what it says here. In the sutras, it is taught, since existence is beginningless, so that means infinite. Right? There is that there was no, like you can't find a beginning to your continuum of lives, is what it's saying. Right? So since, and when they say existence, cyclic existence, it means yours, you. You know what I mean? You're not contemplating for somebody else. I mean, others too, it's true of. So it says here, in the sutras it is taught that since cyclic existence is beginningless, our births are also beginningless. Therefore we have been reborn and died incessantly, so there is no body in cyclic existence that we have not taken, no place we have not been born, and no one who has not been a relative such as our mother. Right? And relative there means, you know, so it's making that point, right? It's saying, and in the commentary they say that, you know, everyone has been our mother, our father, our brother, our sister, our child, our niece, nephew, aunt, uncle, grandparent, best friend, and so on. And so this idea, right, that you're infinitely interconnected, that's what that's getting at, right? Over a beginningless period of time. So beginningless means it goes back infinitely. And then he says, moreover, this is not only true of the past, they will also again be in the future. Therefore, reflecting in that way, you should try to gain strong certainty that they have been your mother, for once that certainty arises, it will be easy to remember their kindness and so forth. On the other hand, if it does not arise, there will be no foundation for remembering their kindness and so forth. So here, right, actually, I mean, this could see, in one way you could say, oh, well, that's just a philosophical Buddhist point. If you have beginningless time, then you have an infinite relationship. But the idea here, right, is, you know, if you think about it, if you're going to really contemplate this, first of all, you're changing your self-image in a way, right? If you usually view yourself as a sort of, I don't know, like very narrow. I sometimes, like, I remember this sometimes. Sometimes I work with people like who like as a therapist, when they said like, I can't really, like I would say, oh, what do you plan, like say a teenager or a young adult, I would say, so what are you thinking about, like, what do you want to do in the future? What do you want to plan? And they would say, I can't really think more than like 5 days ahead. Like I could plan something for this weekend, with my friends. That's about as far ahead as I can go. And I'd be like, how about like the following weekend? Well, I don't know. Like if there were a really cool concert, maybe I could think about that. But like, it's hard to think that far ahead or something, And the same thing going backwards. Like, it's like, like, well, last week I did this, but I don't really remember. It's like, so, and then like we can expand that, right? We can expand our sense of context for ourselves, right? Here we're expanding the sense of context for ourselves infinitely, right? You're saying, I have been and will be infinitely connected with others, right? So it's changing your self-image is my point. Does that make sense? That's why I'm bringing that up. So this first point it seems simple in a way, it's only 2 paragraphs, but the implications for meditation practice are huge, right? Because you're meditating on, oh, this is who I am, right? Like I'm someone who's been infinitely interconnected, and all these people I meet, like I've been connected to again and again. They were my mother, they were my father, they were my brother, they were my sister. One other thing you'll notice here is that, of course, an implication logically of this point, that's been pointed out in some other, many people point this out, is if we're infinitely interconnected with others, of course they've also killed us, right? And they've also robbed from us, and we've robbed from them, and we've killed them. And part of the point here that it's getting at is, but this is developed bodhicitta, so that's not helpful. Does that make sense? Like, whereas if you were to focus on that aspect of the past relationships, it would make you, actually if you were to focus on that limitlessly, what you would develop is not bodhicitta, you develop paranoia. Right? So if you wanted to become paranoid, you could contemplate that. It's not useful. Right? So what this is getting at, the Dalai Lama says, the point is to develop compassion. Does that make sense? Because compassion leads you to enlightenment. And so it's to benefit yourself that you're contemplating this action to start with. Then eventually it's to also benefit them. Others too. And so with this first meditation, right, you would just contemplate like that, right? So you would think, okay, if you look in the Panchen Lama's Easy Path, there are these points where he'll say, he'll make those points like that, like where you can come up with objections. And that's part of the point of this, right? So you might say, well, like, what's there to say, right? Like, maybe, you have to contemplate, it's like, the point is about this infinity, right? So you might say, well, even in 1,000,000 years, like, so-and-so might not have been my mother. Maybe I was in the hell realms, they don't have mothers there, and then, like, I was somewhere else, and maybe that person wasn't my mother in the past 1,000,000 years. But then you have to stop and go, oh yeah, but we're talking about infinity here, right? This is an infinite, so like, 1 trillion years, 100 trillion years, 1,000 trillion years, doesn't subtract from infinity, right? And then, so you get to the point where you start to go, oh wow, so I'm infinitely, and it's not just was I once, right? But each being was infinitely time. In other words, even if like once every 100 zillion years this person was my parent, that means they were my parent an infinite number of times, right? Because it's infinite. Does that make sense? And so you're developing this sense of I'm infinitely interconnected with all beings. And part of this, I'll just point out, is, like when the Dalai Lama goes around, when I contemplate this, I sometimes think of this. You see, like I remember, I was like being like, the Verizon Center, right? And the Dalai Lama seems like it's for his first time in the Verizon Center, and there's like the Verizon Center is like full of people, right? It's pretty much completely full, right? And you see the Dalai Lama, he oftentimes will go like this, he'll put his hands together and he says, "Hello, my brothers and sisters." And it doesn't look, you get this, when he says it, you get this feeling like, oh, wow, and that's because he's done this meditation. Does that make sense? He's not pretending, right? Like, whereas if you were to say that as like a device, it wouldn't feel that way, right? Where does that come from? He's meditated on this point, right? So his feeling when he meets, and he says that, he says, when I meet strangers, I feel, oh, they're like my brother and my sister, right? And so he has that affection, like when a brother and sister who love each other, not all brothers and sisters do, but when a brother and sister love each other, right, and they see each other, like, after not seeing each other for a long time, there's this feeling, right, oftentimes they hug, right, it's like this feeling of, oh, wow, yay, you're happy to see their face, and right, there's an immediate smile, And you see the Dalai Lama, he has that for strangers, right? I've seen that many times where somebody who's never met him, and you watch them walk up, and he's like, he like grabs them, or he does something like, the way you would to a sibling, right? And it softens the person's heart, but it's because it only works, if somebody did that who didn't have this feeling, you would be like, oh my God, get away from me, right? Like, because it would be like an invasion of space. But it doesn't feel that way when there's love there. Does that make sense? And so when the Dalai Lama goes around and says, "Oh, brothers and sisters, nice to meet you," like you see those pictures of him with like Desmond Tutu, right, or things like that, where it's like it looks like he's his brother, or all these different people. I'm just thinking, like, or he meets with like a senator. I remember that once I was in Madison, Wisconsin, and he had just won the Nobel Peace Prize that year. It was 1989. And I remember, like, I was involved in the event, and, like, the police, so because he just won the Nobel Peace Prize, the police were sort of having to work overtime to be part of his, like, be there all the time and travel with him and sort of be his, protecting him. And I saw the police officers just, because I was there helping. And at first they were like, you could see on their faces, they were kind of like saying that to each other, like, "Oh, great, I got it," some. They were, I think the basic, it's Wisconsin, and they were, ordinary guys, and they were kind of like, "I don't know who this guy is, and what, like, just like, I don't know who this guy is, and I got to work overtime, and it sucks, And then I remember at the end, he went up to each, they had been there for days. At the end, he went up to each police officer, and was like personally like holding their hand. And you can see some of them were like choked up, and they were like, teary-eyed, like, "Oh, thanks, and it was great to spend time," and that's this. Does that make sense? It's this same thing, right? Like, because it came genuinely from his heart, this feeling of they were his brothers in a way, or his kin, that they felt it too, like, "Oh, cousin so-and-so is leaving town." It's like the feeling that was going across you. So I guess my point is that's this. Does that make sense? So you're meditating to feel everyone's my family. Does that make sense? Every stranger I meet is my family. And so you would meditate again and again, right? And part of the point here, which we're going to get into more in detail later, is on this first point, you could start generically, but then you start going through specific examples. Does that make sense? So somebody you feel distant from, right? Like that you have no, like you might start with somebody you don't, like, you can start, well, actually you can start with your mother and father and so on. They say that, start with your mom and think, "Oh, she was my mother in past lives too." You start with your father, "Oh, he was my mother in past lives." And you start, "He was kind to me in past lives," and so on. Then you go on. And then you can go on to even think about, like, so you think about, like, the person behind the counter in the grocery store where you go, or at the 7-Eleven, right? Or the person who cut you off on the freeway, or like the person in the next office over. Does that make sense? You think, okay, they were also my brother, my sister, ultimately my mother, and so on. Does that all make sense up to that? That's the first point. And you just keep contemplating that until you develop this until what he says here, until you recognize them. Does that make sense? And it's an interesting point, right? Because they say in the commentary, of course we don't recognize. They say, like, we can't even remember our last life, right? Much less 100 lifetimes ago or 1,000 lifetimes ago. Some people, like if you reach a certain level of meditation, they say you can, but we can't. So it's like, this isn't, I guess my point here is, this isn't like you recognize them in some mystical way, right? It's through training. Does that make sense? Through familiarizing your mind, you come to this point where you think, "Oh, that's who they are. These are my kin. These are my parents. These are these kind people." Does that make sense? And you train your mind to see everybody that way. So that's the first point. So again, like, it's presented quite simply here, but wow, like, that's huge, actually, wouldn't it be? If, like, you were going around, if you went on the metro and everybody around you thought, "Oh, this is like my kind parent," that'd be that point. Does that make sense? So you keep contemplating. Then you could do this meditation on the metro. You could go back and forth, right, and just do this meditation. It'd be great. You could do it anywhere, is the point. Okay, so that's the first point. Then the second of the 7 points is remembering their kindness. So actually, I'm going to read this also because it's important. So Lama Tsongkhapa quotes Geshe Potowa, who was one of the early masters in the Kadampa tradition. He was like in the lineage of Atisha. So he maintained that the thought remembering the kindness will arise quickly if, after meditating on all sentient beings as your mother, you initially meditate on your mother of this life. So you should meditate like that. You should visualize your mother in front of you in a clear aspect and repeat or reflect, "She has been my mother not only now, but many times past, counting since beginning this cyclic existence. In that way, she was my mother. She protected me from all harms and accomplished all happiness and benefit for me." Actually, I want to go on and read the next part, because the next paragraph, just because then I want to talk about it a little bit. "In particular, even in this life, she carried you in her womb for a long time. And when she had given birth to you, she pressed your yellow tousled hair against the heat of her body. She swung you on her fingertips, nursed you with her milk, fed you as an infant from her mouth, wiped away your saliva with her mouth, cleaned your filth with her hands, cared for you untiringly in many different ways. In addition, when you were hungry or thirsty, she gave you food and drink. When you were cold, she gave you clothing. When you were in need, she gave you her possessions that she herself had hardly used. When even the most basic necessities were hard to come by, she bore great hardship and spared herself no negativity, suffering, or bad talk to get them to give them to you. So you get the feeling here, a couple things. Like one is, this isn't talking about, let's just say it right, like somebody who was perfect, right? Even there it says she did negative things for you. Does that make sense? So this is talking about, like, this isn't idealizing, like this isn't saying that your mother was enlightened or something, right? Like, it's saying, but she fed you. And actually, if you do this meditation and then like, I've done this, like if you then watch, like just, like, again, like ordinary people, this isn't getting at like somebody amazing or something, right? Like, and except for that everybody's amazing in one sense, but the ordinary, like, whereas like, if you watch, again, like I'm going to use Winnicott's term, because there are people who are like, of course there are people who are not good enough, you know what I mean, like, who, like, somebody who's taking, whatever, drinking out lots of alcohol and taking drugs while they're pregnant, so that's a different issue. But they're just getting at like ordinary, decent people, does that make sense? Like, who, like, stop drinking, right? And they eat differently when they're pregnant, right? And like, if you just watch, like, this is getting, again, the meditation here would be part of me watch it, like, do you ever do that? Like, I don't know, like, I remember when, if I was around, sometimes being around my sister, for example, who has 2 kids, like, oh my God, like, and there was like, first of all, the whole pregnancy thing, like, it's incredible, right? Like, unbelievable, like, the person, like, bears a lot of difficulty, right? And then, like, with infants, I sometimes, I shouldn't say this, actually, but I sometimes look and I'm like, to the mother, it's like, I'm looking, I'm going, to this poor mother, it looks like the kid's like a demon. Like, they don't let her sleep, like, they don't let her eat, like, she puts, like, one bite in her mouth, right, and they're jumping on her, and then she immediately, like, is happy to put her food down and, like, take care of them, right? Like, that's just ordinary. I mean, it's not some miraculous thing, right? But, like, you can't even eat, like, a meal, right? And you can't even go to the bathroom, right? Like, I'm like, she just wants to go pee, it's like, they're knocking on the door, or they're crawling, or, like, I was like, she could, like, barely go pee or something, like, and that's just normal. I'm not, like, again, this isn't, like, some miraculous thing, but, like, if you actually watch that, right, just, like, the process of an ordinary, decent parent, it's, like, it seems almost impossible, right? And, like, the sleep thing, wow, like, like, right, like, and that's, I'm like, who does that? Like, if anybody else were doing that other than the person's child, they would want to murder them, right? Like, whereas, like, if somebody were waking you up every 3 hours, isn't it, like, it'd be, like, crazy, right? But they're like, oh, like, and then the mother, and like, again, the ordinary, decent mother, right? Like, where I'm just like, so the kid woke them up like 20 times, they can't eat a meal, they can't pee, and they're like, look how beautiful, and like holding them, and like, oh, so cute, and like, like, wow, like that's really amazing, and that's what this is getting at. Does that make sense? It's describing that, right? Held you against their warm body, like, whereas when it was cold, they warmed you up, right? Like, and it's true, right? Like, so you see, like, the baby, like vomits or something, right? Like, the parent, like, they don't, like, be like, okay, get me surgical gloves, and, like, I'm joking, but, but, like, the ordinary decent mother, right? They, like, it's true, right? They immediately with their, there's no question, with their hands, sometimes, like, you see where, like, they literally, like, clean them with their mouth, right? Or, like, with their clothes, right? Like, they're immediately, like, there's no hesitation to go, like, the same person who ordinarily would be like, if they were wearing, like, their clothing, they'd say, oh, I've got to, like, it's got to stay perfectly clean. Then when they have a baby, suddenly it's like, right, they'll use their own clothes to wipe off snot or something like that, right? And they don't worry about it, like, that now they have snot on them. So that's what he's getting at. It's that kind of simple kindnesses, right? And they teach language, right? Like hours and hours of, like, the, oh, hi, all the, like, a certain tone of voice that people have, right? Like, research, what was it called now? Prosody. That sort of prosody voice that, like, oh, you're so cute. Everybody does this, that certain voice, right, with their, and again, it's like, but the point is that that's what allows our brain to actually start to develop language ability, right? That somebody does that for us, allows our brains to start developing the capacity for language. And so if nobody did that to us, right, we would sort of, our brains wouldn't develop properly. Does that make sense? We might still learn language, but we wouldn't have it would sort of damage our brain development if somebody didn't do that. And so again, like there's Winnicott's point that I was saying earlier, if you're just an ordinary person whose brain works okay, somebody talked to you and held you. Does that make sense? Because the holding is usually important for, again, our physiological and nervous system development, just that somebody held us, right? And it's mentioned here by Lama Tsongkhapa. Right? And then he makes a point here. He says, when there were problems, right? And this is true also, right? That he's saying that the ordinary, again, because it's getting an ordinary person, right? The ordinary mother does bad things on behalf of her kid, right? Like, and that's true, right? Like, it's like, especially they're saying like mothers actually create bad karma and sometimes on behalf of their own children, right? Like getting angry at somebody and treating them, and shouting at them because they're not, not treating their kid the right way, right? And if, of course, if you can give examples, right? Like, what's the word, cheating or lying or something to get something they need, like if they're in poverty, right? Which is true, actually, right? It happens all the time. This is ordinary life. This is just ordinary stuff, right? And so the idea here, there are a couple different points. Like, one is, like what we did earlier, when I asked you to just think of somebody who was kind to you, was from probably later than that. Or this is pre-memory, right? He's getting stuff here that's before you can remember, right? But up to age 2 or 3, which most of us can't remember anything before age 2 or 3. So a lot of the contemplation I'm just pointing out here is you have to look at other parents. That's why I was saying, I gave the example of watching my sister, right? And then say, okay, so my mom did that for me, for sure. You know what I mean? Like, and so it's getting at also like a very basic level of relationship or something. So you actually, if you're doing this, and if you are a mother yourself, of course, then you have your own experience of this, right? Where you know how hard that, how much effort, let's put it that way, how much effort goes into parenting. But so in this meditation, what you would do is you would, so you start off with what Lama Tsongkhapa was saying, by imagining yourself, sometimes, I think this is funny, some Tibetan texts, or some Tibetan lamas, some Tibetan texts actually will say, you were helpless like a bug, but actually even insects can accomplish more for themselves than babies, right? Like, at least an insect can crawl around and find food for itself. Babies can't, right? Like, so you're actually more helpless than a bug, So you actually contemplate that. So you think of yourself, right? You say, okay, I was like, so you think back. You can't remember it, but you contemplate, right? You say, okay, so I was like this creature that couldn't even crawl. Like, what can't crawl? Actually, like if you contemplate, it's like even like every kind of animal when they're born, they can like do stuff. Like humans are much more helpless. Like we're like compared to other, like just the other day I saw like a baby turtle. Like it was like little tiny turtle. It was swimming. Like it was swimming around and like doing stuff. I was like, I couldn't even roll over. So you contemplate like that. You think, okay, I was like this, right? I was completely helpless, right? And it's true, actually, right? Like, and again, whoever it was for you, it may or may not have been your biological mother, but somebody picked you up, right, and held you. And like how many hours did somebody, like, whether it was in their breast or they used the bottle or whatever, but how many hours did somebody hold you to like let you eat, right, to feed you? Like, and like, so somebody did that, right? So you're contemplating, somebody did that for you for hours and hours, like every single day, right? And then like, when I vomited, they definitely cleaned me up, and when I pooped and peed, like, they definitely cleaned me up, and like, that's not that fun, right? Like, nobody, like, it's not the most fun task, right? But somebody did that over and over and over, day after day after day, for me. Does that make sense? And like, you feel, I couldn't do it for myself. I was totally helpless, and somebody did that, right? And then, while they did it, they didn't say, oh, you're a terrible creature, like, they said, oh, I love you, you're so cute, or whatever, like that, right? Like, and like, I didn't there was nothing about me that intrinsically deserved that. They were just being loving. It was love. They were being loving to me, you know, or they were caring about me. Right, and somebody gave me everything. Like, in other words, I didn't have anything. Right, like clothes and shelter and like, and where did they get that? You know, they worked for it. They got that and gave it to me for nothing. I didn't give anything back, actually. Like, they were giving me food, shelter, warmth, and all I gave back was poop, mostly. That was all I had to give back at the time, right? So the point is you contemplate this in reference to yourself. Does that make sense? And it's on this pre-verbal level. And so you imagine that, right? You like, you know, like you've seen pictures. I mean, you've seen it in real life in those photos. You know, like what's it called? Also the attachment, right? Like the sort of look that babies and mothers have when they look at each other, right? Like, again, like if my nervous system developed, somebody did that with me. Somebody looked at me and just like, you know, the whole like whatever cutesy faces and all that. Maybe more than one person, right? But you know, but again, like if you think, and if you even if you feel, oh, but I don't think I was that loved, or something. It's like, well, if you have a nervous system that's working, somebody loved you. Somebody gave you kindness. Does that make sense? So this is getting at that very fundamental level. That's why I was quoting Winnicott earlier. It's not like they taught me all the wisdom of the world or something like that. That's not what this is getting at. It's saying, oh, they like looked at me, you know, and spoke to me and fed me and held me, and you know, because that holding is so important. Again, I've already said that, but you get the point here. So you're actually contemplating that on this very fundamental level. Like in this lifetime, somebody did that for me. And if they didn't, I wouldn't have this body and this nervous system and this functioning, you know, ability to sort of. Again, we sometimes say I'm dysfunctional. We can all say that. Like we all actually, I think everybody, almost by definition, we all came from. You know, every family has some dysfunction. Let's put it that way. But this is saying, but actually, you're functional. Whereas you can walk, you can talk, you can have a friend. Like, that's amazing, right? And it's because there was functioning there. Does that make sense? It's getting at the part that did function. It's not perfect, right? It's saying she even did negative things and so on. We're going to get into this more later. There's a whole point Lama Tsongkhapa says where he says, actually I'll say it now, he goes into it later, but his whole point Lama Tsongkhapa says where he says, you know, and I think this is, I sometimes think this, like, again, I work as a psychologist, sometimes I work with people who have been through the most difficult, very, you know, more particularly difficult experiences. And you know, and sometimes it's sad and difficult, or, you know, but there's also this level that's true, that's like, you know, particularly as parents, like people, what's they say, like, do what they know how to do, you know, or do the, like, there's like, you can't give somebody else what you don't have, right? And so sometimes I'm struck by that. Like, sometimes I think back to my own childhood. I'm like, oh wow, like when so-and-so said this to me when I was a little kid, like, they were wrong, but they were telling me what they thought was the best thing for me. You know what I mean? Like, I can think back, and I can think of these moments, like, I think that with like my grandfather saying sometimes, like, he loved me very much. I can think of these examples where he was telling me advice, and I'm like, oh, he was totally wrong. Like, he didn't know what he was talking about. But it's because, you know, he was a child of immigrants. His parents went through huge trauma. They were very, you know, they were not educated. Like, and so, I mean, he educated himself, but like, you know, I can think back. I remember this the other day. I was thinking about that. I actually started crying. I was thinking because I was like, wow, where it's like this some various pieces of wrong advice he gave me were out of so much love. In other words, he wanted to protect me. You know what I mean? And like, he told me things that were wrong, but he was like deeply loving me and wanting to protect me. And that was where it came from. And I was like, oh, that's so sweet of him. Like, whereas he was like, you know, that was the wisdom he had. You know, and some of it was real, it was good, and some of it wasn't. But, and the same thing goes for our parents. Does that make sense? Like I can think of it with my dad too. Like, I'm just giving examples where it's like, you know, he was a tough guy who knew how to survive. And he was like, and so he gave me advice. You know, I was like, again, like some of his advice, I wouldn't want to live according to it. But like, wow, it was like, he couldn't give anything other than what he had. And so that was the best he had to give. That was like the best loving advice he could possibly share with me because it's all he knew, you know, and so he gave me that. And it's contemplating those kind of things too. Does that make sense? So it's not saying they're perfect, but it's saying, oh wow, like according to what they knew, they tried their best. And that was their best effort in their life, actually. You know, like, and it's sad. I mean, actually, it's not like, if you look at it from that point of view, it's like, oh wow, so like, all these, like, you know, because then the person dies, right? Like, the parent himself dies eventually, right? And like what was their life, right? Like, well, you know, I mean, their effort to give what they knew how to give to the, like when you were very young, for example, was maybe one of the best things they did from their life. And even if they did it sort of wrong, that was all they did. You know what I mean? Like, that was their life. And then their life ended. And you get to this point where it's like, wow, like, that's what samsara is like. Does that make sense? Like, in samsara, like, ignorant, confused beings are going around, and sometimes we act loving towards each other, but it's within the context of our own ignorance and confusion. Does that make sense also? And so you're contemplating like that. Does that make sense? And then it says here, next point. So we're contemplating some relation to ourselves, right? So you're still thinking of this relation to your own mother. It says, when her, or whoever was raised you and was kind to you in this way. Again, it's in this very fundamental way. You get the point? It says, whenever her child suffered from a disease and so forth, she wished from the depths of her heart to die rather than for her child to die, or to be ill rather than for her child to be ill, and so forth. With effort, she did whatever she could to eliminate her child's suffering. And again, like, this idea that, like, it's like, wow, like, in other words, if you contemplate that in relation to yourself, right, as this little creature, right, it's like you have to feel like, wow, like, you know, like, wow, that's amazing that somebody would feel that for me, right? That somebody would, like, when I was sort of, you know, actually, I'll share my own example. Like, this is true about me. Like, when I was born, I had a kind of a blockage in my intestines, so I couldn't digest food. And my mother took me to, like, the doctor, and she was a first-time mother. I was first child. And the doctor was like, my mom could present as a little bit anxious sometimes. And so the doctor thought she was being this, like, neurotic, anxious mother and said, go home, you know, like, and then she went back, and again he said, go home. And, like, you know, it was like this. She couldn't sleep at night. She couldn't, like, I was vomiting, and I was not gaining weight, and, like, you know, so she was, like, up all night worrying, and, like, and finally she took me to another doctor, and he said, oh, he needs emergency surgery, or he'll die, and they took me to surgery, and they saved my life. You know, it's like, it's only because she took me to 3 different times, you know what I mean, like, and, like, because she couldn't sleep at night, like that, you know, like, she's like, I'd rather, you know, and I know that was the feeling for her, right? I'd rather die than have my child die, you know, I'd rather be sick than have him sick, you know, and, like, wow, like, that's incredible, right? Like, in samsara, where does it happen that somebody, like, that somebody loves somebody else that way, right? That they'd rather have themselves suffer than the other person suffer. You know, and so we contemplate like that. Does that make sense? We contemplate again and again, like that's amazing, right? Like, it's so much kindness that I didn't, and you know, and it's different than kindness now. Like, if I say, like, this is why we're getting at this very basic level. It's like a vulnerable. You know what I mean? Like, I was so vulnerable. You know, you think that, right? We each think that. I was so vulnerable as a toddler, as an infant, and somebody did all of that for me. Does that make sense? And it develops a different kind of feeling when you have the vulnerable feeling in yourself. Oh, and here's that point I would say. To summarize, and this is an important point, by whatever level of knowledge and whatever level of ability she had, she thought single-pointedly about ways to accomplish your happiness and benefit and to remove any harm and suffering from you. Right, so I think for us that can be a key point. Whereas, because it's not saying she was perfect, right? Which actually there's no such thing, you know. You know, it's impossible, right? But like, that's that point, right? According to her level of knowledge and her level of ability, right? And so this is the opposite of that sort of, like, I sometimes think of that as like this, I don't know, like modern cynical perspective, right? Like, oh, all my problems are because of, you know, it's like this, like I said, a kind of cynical, kind of gross misunderstanding of psychoanalysis that people sometimes have. Like, all my problems are because of my mother. Like, and again, that's not to say mothers aren't, you know, the point is, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, everybody's imperfect. Father's imperfect, mother's imperfect, you're imperfect, I'm imperfect, right? But within that context of our foolishness and confusion, that we love somebody else and sacrifice for somebody else is incredible. Does that make sense? Anytime we do that is incredible. And whoever does it, it's wonderful. And then he makes an important point. He says, if by meditating in this way, a mind remember her kindness that is not just words. Does that make sense? It's an important point. It's not just words, has arisen. You should then meditate recognizing other friends, relatives, your father, and so forth. So this is the important point here, right? So you contemplate again and again, and if you notice, Lama Tsongkhapa is mainly here emphasizing pre-verbal, actually, right? He's mainly emphasizing when you were an infant and a toddler. You can expand that out if you want. In other words, you can also think of kindness received as a teenager and as an adult and as a, whatever, as a tween, and as a, what do they call it? The latency years. There are all these, there's all the different phases of childhood. But contemplate as many as you want, and contemplate however you want. But the goal is what he says here, where it becomes not just words. In other words, where you develop an actual feeling. Does that make sense? Of, wow. Like this feeling of like gratitude or of love or of affection or of warmth. That is, some put, I can't remember who said warmth, but this kind of feeling of like where it's an actual inner experience. Does that make sense? That arises at a certain point. And again, if it doesn't work with your biological mother at first, use your use a grandparent, use whoever, use an aunt, use an uncle, but don't leave out this early phase. Does that make sense? Whereas you can contemplate, and sometimes for some people it's easier to start with, oh, I remember this time that they took, whatever, like, so-and-so took me to this place, or, start wherever it works for you. Does that make sense? To get an experience, but don't leave out, Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying, don't leave out the first, from when the womb all the way through the first, up to age 3 or 4. Don't leave that period out. Because in a way, he's getting at the same thing Western psychology has shown, right? Which is, like, that's the most powerful time, right? In terms of development. And so if you leave that out, you miss something. And again, this idea that whoever it was, I don't, it depends on your own history, but it is true what Winnicott said, right? It was based on just purely scientific, what's the word? Evidence. If you're here doing what you're doing now, somebody was very kind to you. What did he say? I like that line. Everyone who's sane and everyone for whom life means something owes an infinite debt of gratitude to a woman. And he was making a point. It's usually women, isn't it? The vast majority, not always. There's some that are wonderful, but usually it's women who are doing that, who particularly care for the youngest of us humans. Okay, and then he gets to a point. He says, once you have developed an experience that's not just words, right? So once you're moved, you feel that towards your own mother or primary caregiver from childhood. Again, I say primary caregiver, but some it really is though sometimes. Sometimes like, I know people who, were raised by their grandmothers or, so that would be that person or so on. But even if you think of that very early period of time, it was somebody else who held you and so on. But whoever it was that played that role, or if you were adopted, they're all different. Well, that's the mother. But, there's sometimes, or like there's somebody where the mother died in childbirth and somebody else took over the role or something. So I'm just saying whoever it was that played that role. Actually, the Buddha had that experience. His mother died soon after childbirth, so he wasn't raised by his biological mother. And yet, interesting, he still felt great gratitude to her and he went to the heavenly realm, right, for a period of time to teach her after he became a Buddha. So he still, actually, it was interesting, right? The Buddha wasn't raised by his mother because she died. But he still felt so much gratitude to her for having carried her in his womb, having carried him in her womb, that when he became a Buddha, one of his actions was to go to the heavenly realm where she had taken rebirth to teach her the Dharma because he loved her. Anyway, it's interesting. So anyway, the point then he says is, then you could, and this is going to be a pattern, so I just want to emphasize this point. At the bottom of page 140, he's saying something that's very important. So when we did equanimity, this is where I'm going to go backwards for a moment. When we did equanimity, right, do you remember we started with, we started with the neutral person, and then went to the friend, and then to the enemy. Here you start with friends, right? You start with those you're affectionate to. So you're going to, again, after you've done this contemplation in relation to your own primary caregiver or mother, then you go back and you say, okay, now I'm going to think of and this is important. You don't think generically, but you pick a particular person. So he says, think of your friend, your relative, your father, and so forth. So pick individual people and contemplate, this person also has been kind to me in that way. Does that make sense? They've been kind to me in this life, but also in past lives they've been kind to me. And they were my in past lives they were my father, and also they were my mother, and they held me, and they nurtured me, and they fed me, and so on. And so you would do that, like you could do that in relation to your best friend, in relation to your dad, or relation to whoever, your brother, your sister, whoever you want. But somebody, this is actually, the important point here, just to be clear, because you start after working on your own, with your own mother, you pick somebody you feel good about. That's the point. So pick somebody you feel good about and do the same contemplation in relation to them, saying in a past life, they were also very kind to me in that way. And in many past lives, they were kind to me in that way, and you contemplate like that. Then you pick a neutral person, a stranger. Does that make sense? And you do the exact same contemplation in relation to them. You say, this stranger who I don't even know, and this life sort of ignore, and a past life was like that to me. They were my kind mother, and they cared for me, and they looked after me, and they held me, and protected me, and gave, wanted my well-being more than their own, and so on. And then you do it in relation to an enemy, somebody you don't like, and you contemplate the same way. But each time you pick a particular person. Does that make sense? You don't just say generically, oh, everybody. But you actually go through individual people, so you would say like, and you would actually go through and pick different, and why do you do that actually? Think about it for a moment, right? Part of the point is like, I want to say this actually, because it doesn't say it in the text, but it's obviously true, is that you're going to have, if you actually do this, you're going to have resistances. Does that make sense? Of course, I think Lama Tsongkhapa here would take that for granted. It's obvious. In other words, obviously, if you start doing that, first of all, you may have resistance in relation to your own mother. You may think, oh no, she wasn't there for me in some way or something, right? But he's saying, okay, fine. But then you have to contemplate what he says, right? According to, within the realm of who she was and what she knew, her own knowledge and ability, she did that, right? And then the same thing, if you start doing it so the obvious example is the enemy, right? When you start doing that relation to an enemy, you're going to say, some feeling's going to come up most likely. Well, no, they're not kind to me. They're a jerk, and look how stupid they are or something, right? And they're terrible, and I don't like them or something, And part of the point is you don't, when that happens, you don't think I'm doing it wrong. It's that's why you're doing it in relation to an enemy in the first place. Does that make sense? Whereas otherwise Lama Tsongkhapa wouldn't say pick an enemy. When he says pick an enemy, it means they're an enemy. You don't like them, right? So you're working through that. Does that make sense? You're saying, this enemy was once incredibly kind to me. I'm projecting enemy onto them, saying, oh, that's who they are. They're intrinsically that way. But that's just my self-centered mind because they didn't do what I wanted yesterday or for the last few weeks. And so now I'm calling them enemy. But the reality is, part of who they are is somebody I'm infinitely interconnected to over beginningless and endless, right? He already said this. From beginningless time and on into the future, infinitely. I'm interconnected with this person. And let me connect to them in the most meaningful way, through love. Does that make sense? By remembering their love for me in past lives. And remembering that our connection is, although it doesn't appear that way to me right now because of my own self-centered egotism, the only important way in which we're connected is through loving connection, loving kindness. Does that make sense? And all this other stuff is just meaningless, egotistical projection. And, it will come up and you'll feel it, and you'll think, I don't want to think of them as kind. And that's good, because that means you have work to do, and you keep working. And that's how you progress in this practice. Does that make sense? And the same thing with the neutral person. When you start thinking, oh, this neutral person was so kind to me, and we're infinitely interconnected through kindness, and they've cared for me from beginningless time, an infinite number of times they were my mother, and father, and they were my grandparent, and they gave me everything. There's going to be a part of you that's going to say, no, they're just a person, whatever, they're just so-and-so, I don't care about that. And that's the point, you have to work through that. Does that make sense? And part of the idea here is if you work through that with one person who's a stranger, and then another, eventually that's what changes your mind to other people. Does that make sense? If you just say generic strangers, not much happens. But when you go through specific enemies and specific strangers, and you develop this experience, then when you meet new strangers, it'll happen more naturally. Does that make sense? And eventually become your spontaneous feeling. Like the Dalai Lama when he meets strangers, right? He doesn't have to do that now in relation to every stranger because he did it in relation to a number of strangers and then expanded it outward until it became his normal way of being in the world and relating to others. And that's what we have to do. So does that all make sense? Any question about these first two? Right, so it's 7 points. So these are the first 2 points. Recognizing or meditating or seeing all beings as one's kind mother, as one's family, as one kin. In the book I read, I also find it's interesting, etymologically, kin and kindness, right, are connected. And in the word, because it's recognition of that feeling of connection. Right? It's getting at a kind of feeling of connection, and that's what we're trying to develop here. Is a feeling of closeness and of warmth and of affection and gratitude to all beings, but starting with individual beings, right? One's own mother, one's father, one's friends, one's whoever, And again, the main issue being it's category. You pick individual people from different categories, right? So whoever you feel, oh, this is somebody I like, that's the friend. Whoever you feel, this is somebody I don't care about, that's the stranger, I'll call it. Whoever you feel, I don't like them, that's the enemy. And then you have to contemplate and meditate on them in the aspect of having been your most close person. Does that make sense? Who cared for you when you were most vulnerable and most in need and so on. But any question about those first 2 points? Okay. So now we'll go on to the third point. But I want to emphasize something again before we do. Right, so Lama Tsongkhapa said earlier, it's these first 3 points. He didn't say this part, but I think it's true that these first 3 points are the most difficult. But they're also the one, he did say this, that those first 3 are like, it's almost like they're the first 3 dominoes. If you had like dominoes lined up. If you knock those 3 down, the rest are going to fall. Does that make sense? So you've got to get these 3 points, which are difficult, I think, done well in your meditation, and then all the other things will happen. All the other up to bodhicitta won't be difficult. But these, they'll sort of flow naturally, like dominoes falling. You'll still have to contemplate and meditate on them, but they'll sort of, it'll get a moment. These are the 3 that give the momentum that carry the other points.
Should you always do every point in a meditation session, or should you sometimes just spend the whole meditation session like trying to cultivate 1 point or 2 points of the training?
Usually what that happens is like to differentiate. Like there's 2 different. I mean, there are many different, but sometimes people do like what they call almost like a review meditation or something. That's where you just run through the whole thing, and that's just to familiarize yourself. Though it's not. That's not actually. You're not really making deep progress with that. You're just sort of creating. They call it creating imprints of the practice, right? And that's like. So that's a valid form of meditation, but that's not where you're trying to really make, that's where you're like laying down familiarity, or you're putting imprints for the path into your mind, which is all good. But then when you're really trying to sort of work with the stuff, then it's better to slow down, actually. And, you could just do, like, then it's up to you. I'll give my own example. Like if I were doing a review meditation, I might go through all 7 points, and in fact, go, okay, now I know the whole. I can do it forward, I can do it backward. Great, I know what it is. I memorized it. I'm familiar with it. That's useful, but that's not really working through the emotional part of it, or the real inner transformation. So when you're doing the real inner transformation, then it's better to really slow down. So you might just and then it depends how long your session is. But my own experience with that is it's better to sort of stay with fewer points, and also to go with what's working, in a sense, because you're trying to transform yourself. So, I'll give you an example. Like, one day, you might be like, let's say this right. Like, one day it might be like you might really have an easy feeling of if you've been meditating for a while on like, okay, everybody's been my mother, but like. The feeling, like as you go through it, it's like, oh wow, but it's really hard to develop this one, like, let's say to meditate on the stranger being my mother is really, and you might like be working through something and really working on that one. And you might spend the whole session just on the stranger, But another day you might go through 2 or 3 points. But like to stay within, like what I'll usually do myself is I'll sort of say, okay, for a while I'm going to stay on these 3 points, and whichever of those 3 I feel like on that day, So like let's say. Remembering the kindness of my mother of this life, and then once, if that arises, because he says only when that arises experientially. So I'll give an example, okay, from what he says. Like I might spend 3 days just thinking about the kindness of my mother in this life. You know, just sort of going over that and over it. You know, trying to get it, like, trying to really have it give rise to an inner experience that's not just words. But then, as he points out, then there might be another day where it's like, oh, that came really easily because I've been contemplating it for days. I'm going to move on and apply it to my friend, you know, and sort of really work on that the whole session then today. But then the next day when I go down to meditate, I'm like, oh, I'm not feeling it so much. If I go on to the friend again, it's not going to feel very, so I'm going to go back actually and just focus on my mother of this life. And do that again, and it may take a few days again of doing just that. But then if it arises easily, I might say, oh wow, now it's arising easily, let me jump ahead again to the friend. But not go further than that, you know what I mean? And really just sort of, you know, and then eventually you'll sort of say, okay, now the friend, eventually I'll sort of reach more, okay, the mother, this life, and the friend are going fine, but I haven't really done the stranger thing much, let me go ahead and start focusing on that. You know, and then I might, like, quickly run through the previous couple, like the mother of this life and the stranger and a friend, but then really focus on the stranger for a week, you know, and just stay with that. Because you're trying to sort of, make it experiential, really feel it and have some kind of inner change, you know what I mean? And then, like, if you're doing that, you know, for example, then you might start, even outside the session, right? Like, I'll be thinking, oh wow, you know, like I'm talking to my friend, I'll think, oh wow, this is the person I was thinking that to. Let me try to remember that as I'm talking to them. And then if you're doing the stranger, you might say, okay, as I'm going around today, I'm gonna, you know, when I stop in at the, whatever, like somewhere, you know, for gas, I'm gonna think about the person at the gas station like that, you know.
Like the Mahayana mindfulness thing.
Yeah.
Zopa talked about.
Exactly. So you start applying that one. But if you're doing, in general, you do mindfulness anytime. But if you're meditating on this kind of bodhicitta, you would apply the particular one you're doing that week or day to your daily life also. And that way it becomes deeper and deeper. Does that make sense? It's like it's there in your mind, and you know, each time you, so whichever you're, you know, like whichever one you're doing, you know, and then like for example, then it becomes very powerful. If you're out somewhere in a park and you see a mother with a child, you know, so you're like, you know, oh wow, there's an example. Let me like notice how the person's being, and then be like, oh wow, that applies. Like I was once that kid, you know what I mean? Like I was once in that position, you know. So it all applies to your meditation. But it's better to stay with 1 or 2 points and not, you know, not try to run through all 7, because it won't. You know, if you do all 7, it's going to not be. Again, it's good to do all 7 if you're just trying to do the review, but if you're trying to really transform your mind, then it's better to stay with even just 1 or 2. You know.
Right.
And again, you wouldn't like. So if you're doing that, you wouldn't move on to this next point for quite a long time. You know, but then we're going to go on to the third point, which is meditating on repaying the kindness. So, again, if you were doing like intensive practice of this, you would move on to that for quite a while, because to meditate on repaying the kindness, if you don't really feel the kindness, it's just going to be words, you know, obviously, right? Whereas if I haven't really developed an inner feeling of being moved by the kindness of others, then I say, oh, I should repay the kindness, it's just going to be a should. So it's going to be like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to do that. You know, but it's not. You're not going to feel much. So it wouldn't have that much power. But if you develop those other feelings powerfully, then the feeling of wanting to repay the kindness will kind of come in a more visceral way, and that's the goal. So the third point is meditate on repaying the kindness. And so, again, I'll go ahead and read because Lama Tsongkhapa says it clearly. He says, there is nothing more shameful than carelessly neglecting your suffering, protectorless, kind mothers, just because you do not recognize them anymore due to birth, death, and transmigration, and being preoccupied with freeing yourself from cyclic existence. And then he quotes Nagarjuna's letter to a student, which says, my relatives have got immersed in the ocean of cyclic existence, and seem to have fallen into an abyss. If I neglect them, unrecognized due to birth and death and transmigration, and sought liberation alone, there would be nothing more shameful. Now I'll read the next part too. Thus thinking, quote, if neglecting such kind beings is unacceptable, even to the ill-mannered, how can I reconcile it with my own ways? So you should take responsibility to reciprocate their kindness. Now again, I just want to emphasize something here. I really do think this, that if you haven't really developed the feeling of the previous points, And this is just going to feel like, this is my own opinion. I mean, I wouldn't say this, but I really do think if you haven't meditated on the previous points, then if you go straight to this one, it's going to feel like somebody lecturing you, like, well, you're not even a good person then, and you should go do it. It would sort of feel as if somebody was sort of like, telling you what to do, and you may not even like it. Does that make sense? It's not going to feel like, you're not going to feel enthusiastic. Does that make sense? And the idea is you should feel enthusiastic, otherwise it's not really helping you. As I say, this one in particular, if you haven't focused on the others much, I mean, again, we want to be familiar with it, so it's fine to review it, but it's not going to be very meaningful. Does that make sense? Because you're just going to feel like, oh, well, so now the Buddha's telling me I should be nice to people and like go help people. Or something. It's like, it's not going to feel, whereas the idea here is more like, I'm just giving another example. Like, I don't know if you've ever been in this role, but I mean, various times in my life, like I was thinking, like a couple of years ago, my mom had a surgery, or another time when I think when my dad was sick, or my grandfather was sick. Where like, the idea is because I did feel close to them, and I did, even though they were all flawed and imperfect people, they're wonderful people also to me. Does that make sense? And the feeling I remember this just popped in my head this time with my grandfather, where it was like, oh wow, what an honor it is to get to help. You know what I mean? Like, you feel like it's like he did so much for me. It's an honor if I could help. Does that make sense? And you feel like gratitude for getting to help or something like that, like for getting some chance to help, to pay back a little bit how kind that person was to you. That's the feeling you're trying to cultivate. You know what I mean? And like, when I say shameful, it'd be like, where the feeling would be like, I remember that feeling, like, my God, like, who wouldn't want to be there? Like, if I didn't want to be there, that'd be bizarre. You know what I mean? Like that'd be, it's almost like, you know what I mean? Like, whereas that's different than, how do I say it right? Like, there's a different feeling where it's like, oh, people would think I should. Does that make sense? Like, there's one kind of feeling like, oh, people would think I should, and I look bad if I don't, or that's like not, what I mean? And that's okay. I guess that's shameful in a way. Like, that's what shame, the version of shame they're talking about here is that in a way. It's like, what do people think of me? But I guess my point is that here it should be based on the feeling of gratitude and of connection. Does that make sense? Where you're like, where the feeling is like, oh, I feel so glad to get to do that. Does that make sense? To get to repay the kindness a little bit. And the feeling is like, I can't really repay the kindness. Whereas the other person still was more kind to me than I was to them. But if I get to repay a little bit of it, it's like an honor or something. Does that make sense? I think the feeling should be like that, but that means you have to really meditate on the other points. Otherwise it'll just feel like, oh, I'm supposed to. So the idea here would be like, and again, he's going to go on to give this metaphor, so I'll just read it. And then I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit. Because he gives a metaphor here. He says, if your own kind mother were restless, insane, and blind, and without anyone to guide her, and were stumbling on the edge of an abyss, right? Like, so he's giving this metaphor, and there are other metaphors like that, like, if the person were drowning, or so like, you would think of somebody I think it has to be somebody, it has to be somebody you feel connected and warmly towards, otherwise you might think, oh, good, I'm not gonna, I didn't notice, oh, well, okay, right, if you don't like it, or if there's not the feeling of connection and warmth to the person, to be honest, then you think, oh, well, maybe good, let's get rid of them or something, So that's not the point, And then, because in other words, then it would just be like, and then I'm going to feel guilty about it. I'm a bad person. That's not the point here. Is not to think, oh, I'm supposed to want to save the person, but I don't really want to save them, and now I feel guilty, and then I feel bad about myself. That's not the point of this meditation. I'm joking partly, but that's not the goal here, right? The goal is you've already meditated on those other points, so you feel connected, you feel warm, you feel gratitude, you feel love, actually, right? And you want to, this feeling of like, this person has done so much for me. Like, I feel like so fortunate to get the chance to do a little bit back. It's like just a small percentage of what they've done for me. That's the feeling you have. Does that make sense? And when you get to that point, right, then when you feel, oh, that person, the mother, and then he goes through like blind means they don't have any wisdom, right? They don't know what they're doing, right? Insane because they have the afflictive emotions, right, that they're driven by, right? And the edge of abyss means they're fallen into samsara and they could fall into lower realms, right? And so you feel like, like the feeling is like, oh my goodness, I want to, like, I want to grab them and pull them back from that abyss. I don't want them to fall down. And so the idea here is once you've meditated on those other points and you have that feeling of connection, of gratitude, of warmth, of affection, and so on, then you meditate on this aspect of them as vulnerable to incredible suffering. Does that make sense? Which is the truth, actually. Does that make sense? Like, there is, because, again, we're not idealizing these people. We're saying, in the context of their own confusion and so on, they've given me love and kindness. But they're utterly confused, and they're in samsara, and most beings in samsara are falling to lower realms. Does that make sense? And so this feeling is like, who else is going to help them? Like, who else is going to save them? Does that make sense? Who else is going to sort of guide them? And if you really meditate on this point, it's actually true, right? Because, like, if you think of, just think of anybody, but start with your own parent of this life, or whoever, or somebody, your grandparent, somebody close to you, right? Like, they don't have, they don't understand emptiness, right? They don't understand, like, the path to enlightenment. They may not understand much about karma and so on, right? It's like, and they don't know any better, right? Like, and so the feeling again here, it's not like, I'll give an example. Do you mind if I'll give a personal example? I remember this one time, like, my dad grew up very tough, and so on. And, like, he grew up in the Bronx and he kind of fought. And he was a businessman. It was very tough. And I remember one day he was like, he had multiple sclerosis and he was very sick and he couldn't move anymore. And I remember talking to him and he was still. I said to him, I said, Dad, you were like, I know you've been tough and angry your whole life, and you're still angry, And he said, this is, again, it was like his best wisdom. He said, like, it's anger that makes you strong. You need anger to survive. I got to be angry to live. And, like, again, again, if I were in a different mode, I could have felt like, angry at him for being, But I wasn't. I was just like, wow, like, that's the best he knows. Like, oh my goodness, like, because I was saying it out of love for him. I was saying, like, you're sick now. Like, it's not really helping you, and he was like, that's how I survive. I got to be angry, and, like, I remember just feeling like, oh wow, like, that's just all he knows. Like, he grew up, he needed, he did. He was saying the truth. Like, whereas he had to fight people to survive, and he got in fist fights and whatever. And it was like, oh wow, that's the best. That's the best he knows for how to survive. And this, it's like this, it's like this feeling of like, oh, he's blind. Like, he's, and like, if he stays angry up till the time of death, that's not good. And it certainly isn't helping him anymore. And like this feeling of like, so even the person's own confusion becomes a cause for more compassion for them. Does that make sense? And then you don't sort of reject them because they don't know better, right? Like, when you have that feeling, I'm just describing the moment. I remember this moment where I was feeling like, I was like, I wouldn't reject him. It's like, oh my goodness, that's all, like, and I would just say something, like, well, I love you. I'm not angry at you. Like, like, I'm surviving, and like, maybe you won't have to be angry. I'm here for you, and I'm looking out for you and stuff. And like, and he like thought about it. He's like, oh, yeah, it's true. You're around. And like, it helped. I think over time it helped him. I guess my point is like, it's like that. I'm just giving like a real example for a moment. So it's like, the person's own confusion and ignorance and afflictive emotions, at this point, if you have that feeling of connection to them, become the cause of even more compassion. Does that make sense? Where, if not, they become the cause of you not liking them. Does that make sense? Like, if you're viewing them as an enemy, and then you see, like, they want this from you, and they want that from you, or they're whatever, or they're confused, or they're angry, or they're attached, or they're arrogant, or they're, right, then you just feel more and more annoyed at them. Does that make sense? But if you're feeling like this, he's saying you have to see them as vulnerable, right? And as blind, and as stumbling, and as about to fall to lower realms, which is, from a Buddhist point of view, an accurate picture. Does that make sense? This is the accurate view of them. And then that they're being difficult is, let's say right, is a cause for more compassion for them, right? Because it means they're just headed in a bad direction unless you help them. Does that make sense? Because nobody else, they never got the wisdom to know how to guide themselves. So that's why they're using this metaphor, right? Without a guide, blind, right? Like, you're imagining this person like on on a cliff and they're blind and they have no one holding their hand to show them where to go, and they're sort of elderly and sort of almost falling down. Even in the easy path, right? Khenpo Rinpoche's commentary to the Panchen Lama's Lamrim, he says, at this point, he says, he gives advice, it's just a practical advice. He says, after having remembered when you were very young, and people who looked after you, and they were, because they were in the prime of their lives at that time, right? Like, in other words, when you were a baby, your parents, if they were the ones who were caring for you, were young adults, right? They were strong, and they were at their, physically, maybe not mentally, but at least physically, they were at their peak at that point, or close to it. He says, at this point, he says, think of them in a different aspect. He says, think of them when they're at their most vulnerable, like when they're suffering, when they're ill, when they're old, and so on, and when they're nearing death, and like, in order to develop compassion. But the point is here is that you have to see them, to repay their kindness, you see them as vulnerable. Does that make sense? And as lost and confused and not knowing what to do, which from a Buddhist point of view is the truth. Okay, so you get that point. And he gives this quote, insane with affliction, right, he says that here. Insane with, he quotes the Compendium of Trainings. Insane with their afflictions, right, with their mental afflictions. Blinded by their ignorance. On a path with many abysses, stumbling with every step. Myself and others are always the basis of sorrow. Migrators are the same in suffering. Right? And that's an important point. He's saying we're all the same in this way, right? We're all lost. And and the feeling here is like, so if I don't repay the kindness, or if I don't give love to others who are lost, and sometimes like we feel that, right? We feel like when we see others being, stupid and annoying or something, we forget that we're also stupid and annoying, there is that we're all samsaric beings. Does that make sense? And so that's this point here. It's like, we recognize we're all samsaric beings. We're all insane, actually, with afflictions, right? Mental afflictions. We're all confused with our ignorance. And like, so you get this feeling here, like, if others have been kind to me over and over in past lives, who's going to be the person to change that? Who's going to be the person to guide others, to hold their hand when they don't know which way to go, and to be their eyes when they can't see, and to be their, to pull them back from the abyss when they're about to fall down. If it's not me, then who would it be? And the feeling you try to cultivate is like, that's why they give this example. They say, either like a parent for their child, or like a child for the elder, for their failing parent. It's like this feeling of intimacy, and if there's nobody else, you know what I mean? Like, there's nobody else to do it, so I should be the one to step in and try to help. And in this case, Lama Tsongkhapa makes another point, which I skipped over. And I'll say, actually, so he says, if someone asks, well, then how should I repay their kindness? Right? How should I repay their benefit? And then he makes a point, he says, of course, if you can repay it in some temporary way, like by alleviating a little bit of their suffering, that's good. And he says, but ultimately, you should repay it by leading them to the path to enlightenment, leading them along the path to enlightenment, basically, right? By giving them wisdom, which will free them. And he says, and then he makes a point, he says, we contemplate like this. In the past, we think, right? So if you're meditating, you think something like this. In the past, by the power of the mental afflictions, which are like evil spirits possessing me, right? So you're visualizing yourself now. You're saying, I have my own mental afflictions, which are like, I'm like like the kid in The Exorcist, or so, right? Like, whereas I'm possessed, but not by some demon, but by the demon of my own mental afflictions. And due to that, I produced all kinds of additional sufferings to those who were already suffering by nature, like putting salt and the like on the injured who were already severely wounded. I will establish all those who have benefited me out of love in the wonderful happiness, in the happiness and liberation of nirvana. Right? So here he's making an interesting point, right? He's saying, and this is true also, if you just look at yourself honestly, right? It's like, wow, like others in past lives and this life have been incredibly kind to me, and many times, they're all suffering. Actually, they're confused. They don't know what they're doing, and mostly what I've done is throw salt on their wounds, right? Like in other words, you're actually saying, well, I've caused others to suffer, right? When they don't know what they're doing. Like in other words, I've blamed them for not knowing what they're doing, and then I've added to their suffering. And here you think, like, that's horrifying. Actually, like in other words, you really develop. I mean, it's not guilt here. It's like or actually, the idea is that if you've done these previous meditations, so don't do this one until you've done those really, to some extent. I mean, memorize it or look at it, but don't do it deeply. Because here the goal is to develop this real feeling of like, oh my goodness, like the last thing I want to do is throw salt on the people's wounds. Like, whereas they were kind to me in past lives, they don't know what they're doing, they're totally confused. How could I want to add to their suffering? Like, there's nothing more horrifying almost than that, right? Like, actually, at this point, if you were really meditating on it, if you thought like, which is worse, going to hell or that, you would feel, oh, that's like so disgusting or something. Like, the idea of like others who are suffering horribly to torment them or something, or like add to their suffering, is horrifying. Actually, you would feel like it's just, like you would feel a spontaneous and natural horrifying aversion to that. Does that make sense? And you would feel, I want to, if I want to repay their kindness, the best way to repay their kindness is to lead them to enlightenment, to nirvana. Does that make sense? And the point here is like, again, it's not like this point about throwing the salt on the wounds and that, it's like, seriously, right? If we view others as like if we really just if we didn't do any of this meditation, right, then we just feel like, well, people who are, right, like, it's just, this is the way people are, right? It was normal life, right? Like, so, normal society, if you look around now, right? Like, so, so people look at somebody else, actually, it's like this, right? Like, so, like, each person looks at the other. Actually, and this is true, like, I just elaborate just for a moment on what he's saying, because this is true between parents and children, or between siblings, or between married couples, right? It happens everywhere, or between nations. On every level this is happening, right? Like, so one person looks at the other and says, they're wrong, and they're being selfish and stupid. Right? And this person looks at that person and says, they're wrong, they're foolish, they're being selfish and stupid, right? And then they sort of like, well, they deserve to hear, and whether it's like they deserve to hear what, they need to hear the truth, right? And so this person's saying, oh, this person needs to hear the truth. I'm going to tell them, or I'm going to show them. And this person says, oh, they need to hear the truth. I'm going to show them, right? And they go back and forth, causing like, they're both miserable, right? And they're causing each other more misery, right? And like, how often does that happen between siblings, between parents and children, between married couples, between neighbors, between political parties, between nations, between on every level, actually, right? Like, this is what we do as samsaric beings oftentimes, right? It's like our full-time job as samsarics to cause each other suffering. And so here, like Lama's Operum often says, like, somebody has to stop that cycle, and the person who's supposed to do that is you. I mean, it's like, it's me, whatever. I mean, like Lama's Operum is teaching, is saying to the audience, you. So we have to say to ourselves, it's me. Like, whereas so when you and somebody else are having this kind of thing where you're adding to each other's suffering, right? Or usually we say, yeah, it should stop. They should stop doing whatever. And as soon as you think that, you're wrong. Does that make sense? Like, there is the idea is like when there's a conflict where two people or groups, either two individuals, two groups are causing each other suffering. The person who's supposed to change it is me. That makes sense? That's how we think. Like, it's my responsibility because they were kind to me over infinite past lives. If you've done this meditation, right? They've been kind to me over infinite past lives. They don't know any better. They're confused. They're blind. They're like, I have to be the one to change it, right? So to not throw salt on their wounds, but to give them kindness and love and guide them and stuff. And so, and then he makes one more point, which I'll read because I think it's an interesting point. He says, in the view of this, meaning this whole meditation, this topic of meditation, although it is indeed said to be inappropriate to look for faults in others, and although you should hold the slightest positive quality in amazement when you see it, here it is appropriate related to misery. So he's actually making an interesting point, I think. what he's saying is, in general, don't look at others' faults. It's useless. And when you see some little good, like oftentimes we say, well, yeah, this person has like a couple good qualities, but look at that, and look what they did this, and they did that. If you listen to conversation, it's often like that, right? Like, and did you see when they did this? And oh my gosh, they're so annoying, and they did that wrong. And he's saying, ordinarily, don't think about other people's faults. It's a waste of your time. Of course they have. Like, his point is, of course people have faults. Like, we're in samsara. What do you think? Like, there's nothing amazing about that. Like, that's like saying, I noticed there's dirt in the forest. Like, of course there's dirt in the forest. That's what forests grow out of. Like, why are you talking about it? Like, it's so obvious. You know what I mean? Like, and he's saying, ordinarily when you meet people, he says, and it's an interesting phrase, he says, hold the slightest positive quality in amazement. He's saying, be amazed that anybody has any good qualities in this mess of samsara. He's saying that's how you should ordinarily go around. Does that make sense? And look at people. But then he's saying when you're doing this particular meditation, though, then it's different. Then you should look at others' faults, not to criticize them, but in this context, to recognize their suffering, so that you can enhance your wish to repay their kindness by freeing them from suffering. So he says here there's a deep meaning to looking at the faults, and the faults in the sense of the suffering, the misery of others. Does that make sense? So that's an important psychological point. Does that make sense? It's like understanding, ordinarily if you look at others' faults, it makes you feel critical of them and annoyed at them. That's useless. Here, when you look at others' faults in the context of having seen them as kind and seeing them as blind and confused, is to develop a specific, it's a psychological intervention on yourself to develop more compassion. Does that make sense? Kind of. So it's an important point, like, when should you and when shouldn't you look at the miserable, confused, foolish aspect of others, right? If you do that in ordinary life, you're going to get critical of them. That's making you a worse person. Does that make sense? But when you're cultivating compassion, you feel connected to others and you feel warmly towards them, then it's useful to look at their suffering and their confusion, because you're saying, I'm going to free them from that. And they need help, and I'll be the one to help them. So then it's useful. Okay, so any questions about this point, the third point, which is meditating on repaying the kindness? Does that have to be clear? I guess we have time to do one last, so should we we'll just do the fourth point, and then I guess we'll have to stop. So the fourth point is love. And like I was saying, if you've done those previous three, then love will come naturally. Does that make sense? So here, a few points. Love, in this context, because again the word love in English can have different meanings, mainly what's being referred to here is the wish for others to be happy, which Lama Tsongkhapa says. It's the thought, how wonderful it would be if they were to meet with happiness, may they meet with happiness, and I myself will cause them to meet with happiness. Pamukar Rinpoche points out there's also a kind of love that comes first in a way, which is a feeling of warmth and affection for others. That's like the beginning of love, and then here it's full. So here you're meditating on the one full. Actually, the other kind, the sense of warmth and affection, would have come already. Does that make sense? Through seeing others as kind, through seeing them as your kin, through seeing them as your kind parent, and so on, kind mother being, you would have already developed that sense of affection and warmth. And so here you're bringing into the kind of full-fledged love of wishing others to be free, to have happiness. Right. So he says here, the observed object. So that means who are you looking at when you're feeling love? Are sentient beings. So any being. So love can be focused towards anybody who is not now endowed with happiness. Does that make sense? And happiness in that context, though, can mean different kinds, right? So there can be, they don't have worldly happiness, or they don't have the happiness of, good rebirth, or within good rebirth, they don't have the happiness of just like having a good day, all the way up to they don't have the happiness of liberation from samsara or full enlightenment of Buddhahood. Does that make sense? So it depends. You can look at in terms of there's contaminated happiness, like they got what they wanted, or there's uncontaminated happiness, such as enlightenment. Right? So if they don't have any of those, So what the point is that in that sense, actually, you can't really meditate on love for somebody who's a Buddha, in this sense, right? Wanting them to have happiness they don't have, because they already have every happiness. So in that sense, it's a sentient being. Does that make sense? That's why it says love is the object of love is sentient beings. It means somebody who's still in samsara, or still suffering, or still not enlightened, and wishing them to have happiness. And notice in the next line where it says there are three different parts to that, right? The first is very passive. How wonderful it would be if they would meet with happiness. That's love, but it's a kind of more passive version. Does that make sense? Then may they meet with that is becoming a little more activated in a way. You know, you're not just saying, like, you know, like if I were to say, oh, it'd be just wonderful if as they were happy. Well, that's good, but it's not particularly, let's see, say it right. You know, it would also be wonderful if a lot of things happen, you know. And then when you start saying, may she meet with happiness, it's a stronger wish. And then when you say, I will cause her to meet with happiness, well, that's quite a different level of commitment, of loving commitment. So what he's saying here is like a person who's meditating on love, having done all those previous meditations, is now cultivating those kinds of thoughts and feelings. That makes sense? And then it says, now this is interesting now, this next section, so I didn't want to go through it. He quotes the King of Meditation Sutra, the Samadhi Raja Sutra, and this is about the benefits of love. He says, many kinds of offering without measure in myriads of neighboring pure fields, so pure lands, constantly offered to the most excellent beings, means to the Buddhas, fall short of a fraction of the mind of love. So he's describing something here which is like the benefits of love, and he's saying, basically what he's saying here is, you know, if you were to sort of be able to travel to the pure lands of the Buddhas, right, and if you were able to sort of go to many different pure lands and constantly make offerings of, like, you know, gold and silver and, you know, dinner and feasts and, you know, cars and houses and so on to all the Buddhas, you would create a lot of merit by doing that, right? And then he's saying, but it would fall short of even a fraction of the benefit of just meditating on love. So love is more powerful. Does that make sense? And he says, that is to say, the merit is much greater than of constantly making offerings of things to the field that is the final object. He's saying even making very vast offerings isn't as powerful or as beneficial as love. And then he says something else interesting. He talks about this other pure land, a pure land called the Thousand Ornaments. So he says in that place of the great king Buddheshvara, sentient beings possess a happiness. So he's saying in this particular realm, so it makes sense, there's a realm called the Thousand Ornaments. He says, and in that realm, the sentient beings there, in that planet, let's say, have a happiness that's similar to the happiness of monks who have entered cessation. So he's saying their happiness is so powerful of a happiness that it's similar to those who have achieved liberation from samsara. So he's saying it's a very profound kind of happiness. Right? Then he makes an interesting point. He says, but then he says, here on our planet, I mean, when he says, he says here, in this field means this planet. So he says, if you're on this planet, and you develop a mind of love towards all beings, for as short as this short, as the length of a finger snap, it produces far more merit than a celibate practicing pure conduct there for 1,000 millions of years. What need is there to mention abiding in love day and night? So he's saying, like, he's talking about, like, this is a great planet to cultivate love, first of all. Right? And he's saying, that's interesting, right? He's saying to cultivate love for all beings here for that long has more merit than living for millions of years on that planet as a monk and sort of practicing Dharma there from here. So he's saying, you have an opportunity, you know, because you are luckily on this planet where you can cultivate this kind of love. And we have this kind of, I'll make a point also, like, you know, there's something, I think that's true, and actually it's implied in this whole chapter, which is, there's something about, like, you know, being a mammal, you know, like this planet, right? When he's talking about this planet, he doesn't say this, but I think it's implied because of the chapter. Like, because we are born from wombs, right? We're born from, you know, and we're like these kind of strange creatures, right? Like, where we're born with parents, and we're born from a womb, and we come out, and then we're kind of like, you know, like, you ever see, like, if you look at, like, again, like I saw that turtle, right? It could, like, first of all, it's not born from a womb, and then it just, like, swims off, you know, and it's on its own. But we mammals, like, are, you know, we have a nervous system where we have to be held, right? And we have to be fed, and we're fed, actually, you know, for the most part, from the body of a parent, right? the mother's breast and so on. And so, like, you know, I think what he's getting at here is like we have a unique sort of physio-psychological makeup that allows us to feel connected in ways that other creatures can't. Does that make sense? Other creatures on this planet, non-mammals, and also creatures on other planets. He's saying, you know, because there are places where there are like humanoids that are not womb-born. That's what he's, you know, like where they could be a monk, but they're not. They're like kind of, you know, they're born from a lotus, or they're born from a whatever. Like, it's like a different kind of planet. They're miraculously born, spontaneously they appear, or something. You know, the humanoid in the sense that they have arms and legs, but they're not human in the way that like we are. And I think what he's getting at is like we have this, because of our mammalian nature, we can understand our interconnectedness. Like all beings in the whole universe are interconnected infinitely, but because of our mammalian sort of setup or something, this planet, right? We're born from the. I mean, my goodness, right? We live for 9 months inside somebody else. You know, what I mean, like if we can't figure out that we're interconnected, like, you know, what does it take? You know, like we literally have an umbilical cord. Like, you know, it's like it has to be cut. You know, and we can't survive unless we're touching each other. You know, and like it's our very biology sort of teaches us our interconnectedness and our interdependence. You know what I mean? Like, here's if we can, so it's like if you can't figure out that you're interdependent and connected, and the others are deserving of love, you know, what planet and what kind of being is going to figure it out? You know what I mean? Like we have a brain that can understand things, and we have a body that literally lives inside another body and then comes out and then can't live on its own without, you know, without the other. And so he's saying, like, you know, I think it's implied here, like, we're the beings who have the best capacity for cultivating love. Does that make sense? Because we have this sort of biological nature. Okay, so he's going on about the benefits of love. That was just a tangent. He says, he quotes Nagarjuna in his Precious Garland. 300 small pots of food one offers 3 times a day fall short of the merit of love sustained for the duration of just one moment, right? So again, he's saying, if you were to offer 300 people, like 300, 300 portions to 300 different people of food, you were to feed everybody, like 300 people every day, for all 3 meals a day, that one moment of love creates more virtue than that. And then he talks about the benefits of love, and there are 8 benefits listed here. So he says, then I'll just read them, list them. He says, so if you cultivate love in general, like if you cultivate this kind of love for all beings, the benefits are you will be loved by the gods and humans, they will protect you, you as well, you will have mental happiness and much happiness, poisons and weapons can do you no harm, you will achieve your goals without effort, you will be reborn among the world of Brahma, and even if you do not reach liberation, you will win these 8 qualities of love. Right? So he's saying all these benefits come from love. There's a famous, it's not mentioned here, there's a famous story of one of Atisha's teachers, Dharma Rakshita, didn't, like, Atisha had a very high view of emptiness, Dharma Rakshita didn't. His understanding of emptiness wasn't very good. But he just meditated on love. Like, love was his practice. So he just continually meditated on love. And they say that there's one of these benefits, right? You will spontaneously achieve your goals without effort. That because he meditated so much on love, that just one day, I think he just like heard some little phrase about emptiness, and he realized emptiness experientially. And it came because he had so much merit from having meditated on love so much. You know, there's a famous story of a Sangha, right? Like he did 12 years of retreat to try to see Maitreya, the Buddha of love, and he couldn't see him. He couldn't have that vision. And then he left the retreat finally because he gave up, and then he saw that dog, right, that was dying and had maggots, and he felt so much love for the dog, he went to save the dog, and suddenly the dog transformed into Maitreya, and he saw Maitreya, and he said to Maitreya, where were you for 12 years, right? And Maitreya said, you know, you had a karmic obscuration, and love purified it. Now you can see, you know, it was love that did the pure, you know, like, so 12 years of retreat wasn't as powerful as that one moment of love. Right? The one moment of love on Asanga's part purified him more than 12 years of retreat, and he was able to see Maitreya. And then here, Lama Tsongkhapa makes a point. He mentions the story of the Buddha, right? And he says, you know, there's a famous, very beautiful story, right, where the Buddha, when he was meditating under the Bodhi tree, right, on the final night, right, when he was going to become the Buddha, and he was attacked, right? They say that Mara, right? Mara is like what, like the demon, right? An external in this case, this external sort of demonic force, right, that wanted to stop him from becoming the Buddha because he knew that he would benefit others. And Mara wants people to stay in samsara so that he can cause them more suffering. There's this beautiful passage, right, in that story where, so the Buddha was being attacked by like an army of demons. It's actually the image. Some of it, we don't have it here. There's many beautiful paintings of that where like armies of demons are attacking. You see the Buddha sitting alone under the tree, and they say, well, what did the Buddha do? Did he take up arms? Did he start fighting them? And they say, the Buddha entered the samadhi of love. Right? He entered to the meditation on universal love. And they say that just by his by the power of his meditation on love, they were unable to harm him. And there's these beautiful pictures that show they threw spears at him, and as the spears came close, there's an aura of love around him in the picture, right? And as the spear hits the aura of love, it turns into a flower and falls at his feet. And they throw like other kinds of weapons, and each one, as it hits the aura of love, turns into a flower and falls at his feet. That may be a literal event that happened, but it's also a point, right? Like, whereas it's a point that, like, when you cultivate love, that's what happens. Does that make sense? Like, whereas, like, others may still not like you, or others may still attack you sometimes, but if you have love, actually, like, let's say it right. Their attacks, first of all, you subdue them. Actually, Kensho Rishi said, he says, the best way to subdue others is to love them. Which is a beautiful point. Like usually you say, how do you subdue somebody with a weapon, or like, threaten them or something. He says, no, the best way to subdue people is through love. And then, actually in that story of the Buddha, it's quite beautiful. So they attack, and he meditates on love, and Mara sort of eventually gives up, right? Or he doesn't give up yet. And then the Buddha, there's that famous gesture, right? The Buddha's like this, and then he touches the earth, right? And when he touches the earth, that's actually the gesture, it's the mudra, or the gesture means mudra, right? So in Sanskrit, mudra, of touching the earth for witness, they call it. It's this beautiful passage, right, where Mara is saying, you don't deserve to become a Buddha. He's like trying to make him feel self-doubt or something, right? And the Buddha touches the earth, and they say the goddess of the earth, right? It's always female. So the earth goddess herself rises up and says, I'm the witness myself to the Buddha, that the Buddha is worthy of enlightenment. I've watched him over eons give his head, give his arms, give his body, give his wealth, he sacrificed everything for others. So he has the merit. And the merit is love and compassion. In other words, he's created the merit of love and compassion. He does deserve to become a Buddha. Because of the force of his love, essentially. Right? And then Mara sort of says, when the earth herself rises up against you, you surrender. So at that point, Mara sort of retreated and gave up. And then the sun rose, and the Buddha became the Buddha. So anyway, the point is like, the point they're getting at here is love is the way to conquer obstacles and conquer one's. It's funny, like, conquer one's enemies. One conquers one's enemies through love because they're no longer your enemy, right? It's the only way to actually conquer enemies, they say, right? Like, whereas if you conquer an enemy through weapons, then they just, like, eventually they regroup, right? And they want to fight you again, which we know, actually, the world too is true. But if you conquer an enemy through love, then you've actually conquered the enemy because they're no longer your enemy, they're your friend because you love them. So he's saying these are all the benefits of love. And we'll just finish this last part. So he says, the stages of meditation on love are respectively to meditate initially on love for your friends and relatives, then for neutral persons, and then for your enemies, and then for all sentient beings. So again, it's that same sequence. Does that make sense? You don't just, and he's making, actually I'll read this next part. Yeah, so, and then I'll make the point. So he says, the way in which to meditate on love is as follows. Just as compassion arises when you reflect again and again on how sentient beings have suffering, and likewise, you should reflect again and again on how sentient beings lack both contaminated happiness and uncontaminated happiness, right? Contaminated happiness means samsaric happiness. Uncontaminated happiness is the happiness of liberation from samsara. And the manners in which they are devoid of happiness. Once you have familiarized yourself with this, the wish for them to meet with happiness will arise naturally if you've done the previous meditations. Right? In addition, having directed your mind to various kinds of happiness, you will then provide sentient beings with those kinds of happiness. So what he's getting at there, right, is, first of all, again, when you meditate on love, you don't just sit there, like, in other words, what you don't do, he's pointing out, is you don't just, after having done all these other practices, you don't then just sort of go, may everybody be happy, may everybody be happy. That's not good enough. That's okay, but that's not enough. Right? So he's saying, you have to, again, think of specific people. So start with a friend, right? And think about that friend and think, a friend meaning somebody you like. Could be a colleague, a friend, a family member. But think about all the ways in which they don't have either contaminated happiness, means things they're lacking that they need in order to be happy in samsara, or uncontaminated happiness. So you think they certainly aren't, they haven't achieved liberation, they haven't achieved Buddhahood. And he said, if you've done all the previous meditations, this is the point, then it'll be easy. There is, because you already have all this feeling of affection, feeling of gratitude, feeling of warmth towards them, wishing to repay their kindness. When you think about the ways they're not happy, you'll naturally start to feel love for them. Does that make sense? If you don't have those others, then you won't necessarily have that. So that's why it comes after. Then you do the same thing to a neutral person, like a stranger, and then you do the same thing to an enemy, right? And you do that over and over and over, repeating it with various enemies, various strangers, various friends, cultivating this feeling of wanting them to be happy and wanting to provide them with happiness yourself. Does that make sense? Feeling, I want to provide them with. And what he says here is an important, interesting point, is he says, if you've done the previous meditations, then you do this one, and you think about the various kinds of happiness that beings don't have, you'll naturally give rise to love, wanting them to be happy. And so you do that over and over again. And then he says, and if you do that, then naturally you'll also start to provide others with happiness. Does that make sense? So he's like saying, it's an interesting point that Buddhism often emphasizes, Buddhist training of it, which is like, Buddhism isn't saying like, maybe not Buddhism, Lama Tsongkhapa here is not saying, go out and start doing, go out and start finding homeless people to feed, right? What he's saying is, meditate on love for them, right? And then he's making a point though, he's saying, because if you meditate on love with them, for them, then you will go help them, and it'll be sincere and from your heart. Does that make sense? So he's saying, develop love, and then he's making a point, he's saying, then let that love express itself in your behavior. Does that make sense? But he's saying, first cultivate love in your heart, and he's implying something. He's saying, then, of course, act on love, be loving, help others. But if you do it in that order, of course, your help, as he going back to what he said earlier, will have all those benefits. Does that make sense? If you do something with love in your heart, as he said, you'll create more merit than if you were, for thousands or millions of years in this Pure Land, or if you were doing all these other things. Like, all these benefits will come if you do things out of sincere love. Does that make sense? And whereas just doing the behavior without the love is not. That's why he was drawing the contrast. Like, making lots of offerings with no love isn't that powerful, whereas offering something out of love is more powerful. Does that make sense? And we know that. If you think, I'll say my own experience. I noticed that, like, people who have, like, when I think back to people who have done something in my life, I think back to, like, the times where somebody did it and I knew they were doing it out of a deep, sincere love. It's like humongous, actually. Whereas there are other people who did something, but I didn't know why or something. Like, it doesn't have the same relational impact, and that's implied here. I think it's like when you do something out of genuine, deep love for somebody. Part of the implication here, I was talking about the incredible power of love, is it changes everything. Actually, right? It's one of those things where someday the earth, when you become a Buddha, the earth goddess will say, I've been watching. This person did that out of love. I'm the witness. Does that make sense? It's like the Buddha himself. You're starting that path. Okay. Any questions? So next time we'll pick up with compassion then. We've covered love. That's the next point. 7, it's compassion. And remember, Lama Tsongkhapa made that point. He said love and compassion can come in either order, actually, right? If you're focusing on how, he made that point earlier. He says, if you're focusing on how others are deprived of happiness, then you give rise to love. If you're focused on how others are suffering, then you give rise to compassion. But I personally think they come in this order in the Lam Rim. Even though experientially they can arise in either order. Love is slightly easier, right? Like, love wanting others to be happy doesn't require as much bravery as compassion. Because with compassion, you have to be willing to face the suffering of others. That makes sense? So, I mean, even though they can come in either order, overall, they're both very profound, beneficial states, but love is just slightly easier, because with love, you don't have to face the real dark suffering of others. With compassion, of course, you do, right? In other words, if you're focusing on wishing others to be free from their suffering, you have to be willing to look deeply at the suffering of others. So I think it just takes a little more bravery. So I think that's why this is my personal opinion. Does that make sense to me, that for that reason for compassion to come second, is it requires more courage. So maybe you have to build up to it. Okay, let's do the dedication. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara.